Hey, everybody. I am so happy to see you here. I'm Renee Hobbs, and welcome to this Media Education Lab webinar. Um, my humanities people have joined me finally,
Yay.
for this wonderful session. Christian, you and I have known each other for a couple of years now, and
Yeah.
I feel like we have been exploring this way in which media and technology and education intersects with the humanities. So I am simply delighted to welcome you to the Media Education Lab
I'm
for
really
what I
glad to
think
be
is
here.
going to be a great three-part series. Um, if you're joining us today, it's probably because you know how much fun we have at these things. And trust me on this, Christian has planned an absolutely awesome experience. So I'm just going to say, Christian, thanks for letting me learn with you for the past 2 years. And I can't wait to see what I'm going to learn in the next 3 weeks with this three-part series, The Urgency of Poetry in a Digital Age. Take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Renee, for learning with me, as you say, but also being a mentor of sorts. I think all of us probably know, being in academia, what a privilege it is whenever you find that teacher or that advisor who really takes you under their wing and shepherds you in what you want to explore. And that becomes even more rare, as you get out of grad school to find. And Renee has been that for me, and it's been a privilege. So I'm really thankful and honored to be here, and I'm excited for what we're going to learn together over the next 3 weeks. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen, and we'll kind of dive in first with just a real quick overview of what we're going to cover in the next 3 weeks, so that you get kind of the narrative arc of where this all is headed. And then we'll just dive straight into what poetry can be for us today, um, listening to some poems, and hopefully asking some questions that spark a lot of connection and curation. So I will share my screen. Let us know in the chat if for some reason you can't see something. I'm going to back up here just a little bit. So our first session today is going to be this session, Poetry to Die For, or What Can Poetry Be for Us Today? I'm going to lay out 5 kind of thesis statements for what I believe poetry can be for us, what it should be for us, kind of outside of the realm of literature. And I'll say more about that in just a minute. Then next week, we're going to look at several different ways of teaching along these thesis statements. So we're going to look at ways of teaching poetry that help our learners connect deeply and intimately with words, and the kind of ambiguity and paradox that poetry can help us capture, and not just teach poems, but actually teach poetical thinking, which is so essential, I think, to grasping why poetry is so important for us. We'll round out with something called Poetry for Humans. I'll say more on that later. Essentially, this is a live kind of reading of a poem, a live study of a poem, if you will, that has some vulnerability mixed in that makes things a little exciting. I'll say more about that in just a minute. But for now, I want to dive into today and kick off with a few rules. We all love rules, I'm sure, right? Rule number 1 for today's session: I really hope that you will not pay attention to me. I want you to let your thoughts wander. Because why poetry is so amazing is not just because of what it contains in these very often simple or short forms, but it's what it allows us to connect to in the broader world. All of these, all poems, in some senses, are launching off points. They don't want us to stop with them. They want us to keep going out into the world or with other connections, whatever it may be. Rule number 2: today we are going to search for questions as answers, not answers to questions. You're going to see a lot of questions pop up in what I'm going to share. I like questions as a kind of toolkit for exploration, so that as we encounter each new poem, we can bring not just maybe the kind of like grade school questions that we're sometimes asked to ask about literature, but really lively questions that, again, don't preclude too soon on an answer. And then finally, I want us to let things to breathe today. When I taught high school English, I don't teach that now, but when I taught high school English, I often used to say to my learners that dissected things become dead things. And I don't know about you, but I didn't have a very good high school English teacher, sadly. And I very much felt like we should have just been in science class dissecting frogs whenever we were looking at poems together, because I left the class with these flimsy, lifeless things. And you would have thought that these poets were the most boring humans on earth, quite frankly, with how we engaged with their work. So I want us to really let things breathe today. In that vein, and I'll mention more about this, but at one point in my life, about a decade ago, I was planning to become a pastor, which would just be a very different life than the one I have ended up in now. But when that was me, and when I would deliver sermons, I would usually start a sermon with just a minute for us to quiet ourselves. And we won't take a full minute today, but I wonder if we can all just pause and take a breath before we explore together. We're very likely coming from hectic days where poetical thinking was not the norm. We might have been on a dozen Zoom calls. We could have been in a hectic classroom. We could have been burdened by the bureaucracy of education getting in the way of what we actually want to do for our learners. So let's just take a minute, a second, and just breathe and let that stuff fall away and enjoy words and exploration together. Okay, let's dive in. So first, today's session is going to be all about what poetry can be for us now in a digitally saturated, intense environment in which we often don't know who is addressing for us. I became really curious with this question, what poetry can be for us, because of this guy, Osip Mandelstam. Osip Mandelstam was a poet who lived from 1898 to 1937. He was a Russian poet. Stalin made him an enemy, to Mandelstam's credit. And Mandelstam once said this jokingly, if you can take this as a joke: poetry has never mattered more than it does now in Russia. Is there anywhere else where poetry is so common a motive for murder? Which is hard for us to believe. I'm going to toss out one other example, but just in the chat, and Renee, maybe you can help me here and see some numbers. If I were to ask you how much money you think Edna St. Vincent Millay made from poetry at the height of the Great Depression, what would you say? As a kind of benchmark, at that time, a U.S. senator made, I think, $5,000 a year. Do we have any answers there?
Did you say 1935?
Yeah, at the height of the Great Depression, kind of early mid 1930s. Yeah.
2,000 a year, 200 a year, 4,000.
$30,000 a year. Wow. She made the equivalent of what would in today's dollars be $250,000 a year. To imagine that poets were once rock stars, or people were dying for poetry, seems so absolutely foreign to us. I don't want to start there entirely, though. I want to give you a little bit of background about why poetry is so important to me, because poetry and memoir are very tightly connected in my mind. And I hope they are for you too. Actually, as I share this, if in the chat, if you just want to drop in when you first remember loving poetry, it could have been a song that spurred it on. It could have been a hymn. It could have been a poem. It could have been a whatever it might be. Maybe it wasn't even a poem. Maybe it was just something that sounded like a poem, right? And should have been a saying that your mom or dad or grandpa used to say to you, right? So here's my little journey with poetry, and then we'll go into some questions that I've been concerned with over the last few years. Poetry, a love of poetry, really started for me in 1995 with Alan Jackson and Dolly Parton, and I owe a lot to Laura Shockley, my mom, for playing country music on the way to school. This is really where I learned that stories could be lyrical, that we could build stories with stanzas and choruses. And I didn't know at the time, but that was planting a seed for loving poetry. It continued for me through acting. Again, we're not even getting to literature class, right? But learning how to play Shakespeare, learning how to be on the stage and to let the lyricism of language come alive in me to the point that I could communicate it with someone else. Words began to take root. Then I had a class on John Milton around the time that I was thinking of becoming a pastor. I had this class on Milton, and I learned that poetry could actually do some heavy lifting that I wasn't told about before. And through Paradise Lost and a lot of Milton's smaller works, and imagining him sitting there with his daughter blind, reciting out these phrases, moved me incredibly. And that's really when I chose poetry over a lot of other disciplines. It deepened in me through Christian Wyman. I'm not sure if you all know him. He used to be the editor of Poetry Magazine. This is a really important book to me, as you can tell by all my tabs. I first read this in 2014. It's called My Bright Abyss. It is really memoir and poetry textbook all at once. He will guide you through his favorite poems, not why they matter as poems, but why they matter to him, which led me to another really important thing in my life, which is memorization. And I'm going to recite some poems for you today, but I began memorizing poems as a kind of antidote to anxiety and depression, at least a partial one, because I wanted something else in my brain beside my own thoughts. It escalated into grad school, where I began studying Osip Mandelstam more deeply and saw theology and philosophy come alive in this really complex individual. Over the last few years, I've been doing this thing on the side. I teach this class, Singing Out of Silence. That's where the SOS comes from, about exile and poetry, why poetry matters during really tense times. And then just for fun, last couple of years ago, I had my own first published poem, oddly through a choral piece, which was not something that I expected, but it's really nice to have talented friends who want to do things with your words. And then finally, this year, I started this thing called Poetry for Humans, a little YouTube show that's about 15 minutes each episode. And we read a poem together and let it spur on connections and stories instead of just being a literary analysis. But let's dive into a few really important questions. I can't wait to read, by the way, your own experience with poetry and how it came alive in you. Here's this question. Why, when everything else was lost, would someone decide to cling to poetry? We will maybe find an answer to that today. Second, keep these in your mind as we look. Why don't we feel the same urgency to the point that poetry has almost lost its cultural capital entirely until something spectacular happens, like the poem recited at the inauguration recently? And then, what can poetry really be for us? This is maybe the thesis through line for today, but I want to think about this idea that for poetry, for us to actually regain the cultural capital of poetry, it has to become something for us other than literature. And literature is what I mean there. We can't keep taking it into our ivory towers and dissecting it. We have to, not that everybody in ivory towers does that, but we have to figure out the life that's involved in it and primarily see it as its ability to capture human experience in a way that helps us deeply. So let's go ahead and dive into maybe the first thing that poetry can be for us, which is silence. There's an academic at Emory University, Mikhail Epstein, and he's grappled with this idea of silence in a text to the point, especially in prose, where he's wanted to develop a punctuation mark that denotes margin in prose writing, which I find a fascinating and worthwhile project. But at the same time, part of me says, poetry, that's poetry. If we want to see a literary form that respects margin and blank space, we've got it, and it's poetry. This quote from Lucille Clifton, and we'll look at this poem a little bit more in just a moment. Who among us can speak with so fragile tongue and remain proud? There is a question at the heart of poetry, especially when grappling with silence, which is this: what is it going to annihilate in us? And what space will it create for us to find something new? So many poets are grappling with that idea. I've depicted it something like this. And we'll dive into in just a second what exactly those silences can be. But poetry very often is going to find a silence, whether it's something that we expose ourselves to or whether it's imposed on us. And it won't banish the silence. Instead, it will use it as a place to create something new. In other words, silence can be cultivated as a kind of space for exploration. There's a really good book called The Edge of Words, where the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, deals a lot with both Mikhail Epstein's work and also another writer called Margaret Masterman, where he explores this concept of us being able to grapple with the unnameable through poetry primarily. Really, for us to understand why this matters so much, we have to reckon with the fact that poetry is so often trying to capture the unnameable, which means that while poets are often people who love language the most, they're also always up against the edge of what language is unable to say for us. And it's amazing how often these themes come up in their work. Mary Oliver, of course, is another poet who strives to cultivate silence in her work. I love this quote from her. It doesn't have to be the blue iris. It could be weeds in a vacant lot or a few small stones. Just pay attention, then patch a few words together and don't try to make them elaborate. This isn't a contest, but the doorway into thanks, a silence in which another voice may speak. That really leads me to these two kind of silences that we can experience. One is this exposed silence, which in many ways was Mary Oliver's world. If you've read her essays, especially, she talks about the circuitous route to school that she would often take so that she could be by the river or be by trees. And she still goes to that forest. In other words, she exposes herself to a certain kind of silence, to a certain kind of anonymity in order for something new to open up in her. But we also have to grapple with this idea of an imposed silence. So many poets are responding to a silence that's forced on them, whether it's through colonization or political exile, or in Christian Wyman's case, physical suffering. Poets are responding to this silence that's been forced on them. I want to let, if possible, two poets just speak for themselves on this topic. And we'll leave this here for now and move on to our second idea of what poetry can be for us. So first, I want to look at this Lucille Clifton poem, Here Yet Be Dragons, because it really does a good job of grappling with what poetry can be for us. So this is Lucille Clifton, Here Yet Be Dragons. So many languages have fallen off the edge of the world into the dragon's mouth. Some where there be monsters whose teeth are sharp and sparkle with lost people, lost poems. Who among us can imagine ourselves unimagined? Who among us can speak with so fragile tongue and remain proud? It's that grappling of being silenced through time or oppression, and yet standing against it to reclaim our own fragility and to pass it on. And we'll look at that in just a moment. But I want to share one other poem on this topic, in part because I think it might be the most beautiful love poem I've read. This is a poem by Christian Wyman called 2047 Grace Street. And it's a poem that he wrote shortly after a diagnosis of cancer and a realization that his marriage would perhaps be over because of his death, not because of any loss of love. And he meditates on this cosmic scope and then brings himself down into silence. And you'll see that he turns a little sound into contemplation. But the world is more often refuge than evidence, comfort and covert for the flinching will, rather than the sharp, particulate instance through which God's being burns into ours. I say God and mean more than the bright abyss that opens in that word. I say world and mean less than the abstract oblivion of atoms into which every intact thing emerges, out of which every intact thing finally goes. I do not know how to come closer to God, except by standing where a world is ending for one man. It is still dark, and for an hour I have listened to the breathing of the woman I love beyond my ability to love. Praise to the pain scalding us toward each other, the grief beyond which, please God, she will live and thrive. And praise to the light that is not yet, the dawn in which one bird believes, crying not as if there had been no night, but as if there were no night through which it had not been. We'll leave that there, and I want to move to this idea. The poet is Christian Wyman. You'll see his name come up a couple more times today, and I'll also share any of the poems I recite. I'll share them at the end of this so that you can just sit with them and listen for now. So let's jump back into it, and let's think about. And you're going to see that these kind of uses of poetry are going to stack together like Lego blocks or like a kaleidoscope. And we can twist this and use these lenses together and view them in different ways. Poetry can also be for us eternal. And there are so many words that are wrapped up in this idea of eternal. There's a lot of what I mean here is that poetry can be memory, but a stronger memory than we're used to. And I'm going to start with this kind of funny quote from Jerry Seinfeld, and I picked the most 90s picture of him that I possibly could. Jerry Seinfeld in his show, his little Netflix show, Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee, he says this: poems are jokes without punchlines. And this is another talk for another time, or maybe some kind of essay, or I don't know. But there's so much between poets and comedians in their craft, in how they work, in how they write. It's worth exploring. But it leads me to this quote from Dave Chappelle on the word griot. If you've never watched Dave Chappelle's comedy, it is something. Uh, if you want, if you want to see a little bit about him, he has this. He won the Mark Twain Prize for American Comedy. At the end of it, he thanks his mother in this really beautiful way. Here's what he says about his mother and about the home that he grew up in. We had a real oral tradition in our house. I knew the word griot when I was a little boy. A griot was a person in Africa who was charged with keeping the stories of the village. Everyone would tell the griot the stories, and they would remember them all so they could tell future generations. And when they got old, they would tell them to someone else. And they say in Africa that when a griot dies, it was like a library was burnt down. And my mother used to tell me before I got into comedy that I should be a griot. And she'd fill me with every story of Black life, and she would let me understand the context I was being raised in, that I'm being raised in a hostile environment that I have to tame. And my mother used to tell me, sometimes you have to be a lion to be the lamb you really are. So many poets have kept this generational memory for us. They've stood with poetry between time and eternity and helped us to capture and remember. We'll talk about this in just a little bit. Well, actually, I'll bring it up now. One of the things that struck me most about studying poetry in a context of exile, one of the answers I turned to for why poetry mattered then, is because when you go on the run, you pack the essentials. You take what matters most. So people turn to language in its most distilled form. We could use words like concision here, but I think those are often far too mechanical. It's actually sometimes more playful than that. Did you ever have toys when you were a kid? The little capsules that you'd get in the machines at the grocery store, and you drop them into water, and then you'd watch them expand. That's a poem. Something that drops into our minds and expands with some new thought. We carry it in its distilled form, like orange juice concentrate or the sweet tea syrup my granny used to make, so that we can add something to it and find something more. That's what poets do for us. Poetry gives us the ability to preserve our most visceral truths in our most constructed and intimate linguistic forms, not only for ourselves, but so that we can sing them to the next generation. If only we had more homes like Chappelle's, where we were encouraged to keep the stories through whatever format they might find us. I want to go here to another poem, and then we will. Well, actually, we'll wait on a poem for now. We can think about this as we move into our first curation and connection point. What messages have you inherited that you love, and what messages would you want to pass on? Whether through poetry or saying or whatever they might be. Let's actually pause here, and I want to hear already what you've been curating in the chat, what connections you've made, and then we'll move on to our three other things that poetry can be for us. Ooh, the chat has been busy. Renee, any comments pop out from you or to you?
I am absolutely stuck on the connections between poets and comedians. And the quote from
Jerry Seinfeld.
Be a lion,
Oh yeah.
be a lamb. There's something about that that just makes me want to dig into that idea more. And I realize that those are two topics that have never been in the same room for me.
Yeah,
Why is that?
I think that again, if you hear Jerry Seinfeld talk about how to write a joke, and then you go listen to how people write a poem, poets talk about their own craft, comedians as griots. That's exactly it, Lauren. I love that. The processes are so similar. Jerry Seinfeld talks about how he'll take his yellow legal pad and he'll write every day. He very famously has this calendar and he'll mark off days for every day that he writes. And he just says, write every day. And he'll write a funny thought. And then he says, rewrite the funny thought until it has the fewest words possible. Comedians are for us trying to distill experience in the same way that a poet is, so that it expands, so that we feel some kind of release, which there are a lot of funny poems and a lot of sad stand-up specials, right? There are a lot of stand-up specials that I have cried during. I think of Bo Burnham, who grapples in his comedy with the idea of fame, and allows for us to see ourselves and laugh at ourselves at the same time. Aren't poets just doing the same thing? They're distilling some experience to as many words as necessary and no more, and then allowing us to sit with them. Yeah, Hannah Gadsby is another. Oh, Lauren, I'm loving your comments. She's another storyteller comedian, and it's very much this kind of generation of comedians from the 70s until now who have given us that kind of linguistic form. And I think in many ways they culturally replaced what poets used to be.
So do you see Samantha Evans writes that she has done poetry and comedy.
Oh, I love that.
That she has reworked material from one context to another.
Yes.
So, wow, Samantha,
that's amazing. I think that Bo Burnham has done the same thing. If I remember correctly, I've listened to a couple of interviews with him where he talks about writing poetry. There's also probably, if I were writing an essay on this, there's also probably some overlap of like the particular kinds of neuroticism or passion that both poets and comedians experience. Yeah, Pam, I totally agree with you. Like the linguistic playfulness in most rap is something to aspire to. Any other thoughts on these first 2 points? Yeah, the mental health aspect for sure. Okay, well, for the sake of time, let's dive back in. Is that okay, Renee? Perfect. Okay, I'm going to share my screen again, and we'll move on to this idea of poetry as attention. And this is a little bit of where there are seeds of this in where Renee and I came up with the concept for this 3-webinar series. So here's Ted Kooser, who's formerly a poet laureate in the US. I write for other people with the hope that I can help them to see the wonderful things within their everyday experiences. In short, I want to show people how interesting the ordinary world can be if you pay attention. And this kind of led me to this thought that in poetry, we're looking for 2 different kinds of attention. By the way, these images aren't exact. Sometimes this image where I'm saying what writing poetry often is, it's actually reading poetry, and vice versa. But distilled attention is getting at a couple of things. How can poetry narrow an expansive event or moment to make it memorable and accessible? Or, and I say this is a pro level move in part because I wouldn't recommend this as like your launching point for poetry, but also how can poetry just keep the ordinary ordinary? And if you want to read a fantastic book about why that's possible, there's this book that I've recommended to Renee, Attention Equals Life, by Andrew Epstein, a wonderful writer who dives into that very thing. He talks about poets like Ted Kooser who are poets who will see ordinary moments and they will find the special in them. But then he spends a lot of time talking about poets who find ordinary things and they don't make any attempt to make them special for you. And what that does for us. In next week's session, as a little teaser, we'll talk about one of the things that he goes into, the idea of a list poem. And he especially talks about a poet, Silliman, who does this very thing where he takes just a part of speech, a verb, and he gives you a diary of his day through verbs. And you have this ambiguous but delightful list that you live in with him. Why do we need that? We'll talk about that more next week. It can also expand our attention. How can poetry take ordinary instances and expand our vision towards some essential and sometimes eternal, maybe truth, or maybe because we pay attention to it, it becomes eternal, right? Depending on how fancy and philosophical you want to get. Really practically, I want to talk about my own experience with poetry as a form of attention. I mentioned before that poetry for me became a kind of solace in depression and anxiety, and especially after reading Christian Wyman's book, My Bright Abyss. And by the way, thank you to whoever shared the 2047 Gray Street poem in the chat. He's worth reading. He has so many wonderful collections, but especially after reading that and hearing him live. If you listen to Christian Wyman live, he'll not only give you his own work, he'll recite his favorite poems. And you can tell that he's taking solace and refuge in these works. So I began doing that very thing. And poems for me became like a kind of record that I could put on in my head. Instead of having the needle of the day trace whatever circuits were in my brain, which were often unhelpful, I could put on a poem and let a poet take me down whatever trail they wanted to, and then allow, and we'll talk about this more in a bit, allow the ambiguity and paradoxes of the poem to create a new kind of silence for me to live in, a new kind of recultivated space that my brain found more inhabitable. It's very much, that idea of if you were trapped on a desert island without any other resources, would there be enough stuff in your brain for you to entertain yourself? Let's make it simpler. Is there enough right stuff in your brain today for you to be happier or for you to pay attention to what matters? We can populate our brains with the kind of attention that we want to give to things. And poems can be little helpers in this way. Here's a poem on this idea. This is from a poet, Craig Arnold. He died in, I believe, 2008 or 2009, exploring a volcano in Japan. And one of his fellow poets said to him, it would be a travesty to say that just that his life was too short or that his life was cut off too soon, because the volume and the power of his work was really the work of a lifetime even as young as he died. So this is a poem that many of you may already know, Meditation on a Grapefruit, which is, I think, one of the more kind of expansive poems. He takes us through this very ordinary act. This is one of the first poems I memorized in 2015. He takes us through this very ordinary act of waking up to peel a grapefruit, and he allows us to sit with him for longer than we'd pay attention to that normally, and then brings us to some kind of truth. So this is Meditation on a Grapefruit. To wake when all is possible, before the agitations of the day have gripped you, to come to the kitchen and peel a little basketball for breakfast, to tear the husk like cotton padding, a cloud of oil misting out of its pinprick pores, to ease each pale pink section out of its case so carefully without breaking a single pearly cell, to slide each piece into a cold blue china bowl, the juice pooling until the whole fruit is divided from its skin, and only then to eat. So sweet a discipline, precisely pointless, a devout involvement of the hands and senses, a pause, a little emptiness. Each year, harder to live within, each year, harder to live without. Another poem that not only directs our attention, but if you look at the form of the poem, there's not a single period in the entire work. And yet he creates for us so many apparent pauses, so many breaths we can take with him, so many recultivated silences where he wants to take us to some new meaning, some new aesthetic, before he finally gives us just these two lines: each year harder to live within, each year harder to live without. Okay, let's go to something a little bit more bombastic. This idea of poetry as dissent, which Amanda Gorman, am I getting her name right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I think that Amanda Gorman's poem from the inauguration is such a powerful form of dissent. And this quote from Simon Armitage really shook me up today, because even as I want so many people to love poetry, I do think Simon Armitage is kind of right here. There's something about poetry which is oppositional, and it's a form of dissent. I mean, even in its physical form, it doesn't reach the right-hand margin. It doesn't reach the bottom of the page. There's something a little bit obstinate about it. Poetry's always had a complex relationship with language. That's that point that we were talking about, right? That poetry has this intimate form of language, and yet it's always at the end of what language is able to do for us. It's alternative. It's independent. It simply cannot be a mainstream art form.
Woohoo!
Right? Which is, I think, why it's so special when someone like Amanda Gorman pops up and reminds us that while it might not be mainstream, it can be for everyone, right? Boy, I was listening to that earlier today, and her allusions in that poem are just exquisite. So I want to think in these two different categories. Again, next week, we're going to think about this idea of volatile descent, poetry actively fighting against oppression. And we're going to look at Osip Mandelstam's poem called The Stalin Epigram. And we're going to practice this little thing called versioning a poem, which is partly from Christian Wyman, partly from Osip Mandelstam, about bringing a poem into our current cultural and political climate. Boy, if you read that just as a fun thing to do, like comparing Stalin's mustache to two cockroaches on his lips, talking about his like fat fingers. He pulls no punches, and it really ticks Stalin off enough that he killed the guy, which is crazy. But we often don't think about the kind of gentle dissent that poetry can be. And I've got a poem here from Michael Longley that we'll look at in just a little bit. But it deals with these two questions. How can poetry contextualize our suffering by surrounding it with ordinary things? And how does this help us maintain a sense of self? And how does it provide refuge? If I can, this is really what's happening in the story of Job. I find myself returning more than any other books to the poetic books in the Christian Bible. And this story of Job is really about why poetry matters in a lot of ways. Job confronts suffering in life. The color is drained out of his world. And very quickly what happens is that rationality and logic in the voice of his friends approach him and try to give him answers. You've done something wrong. That's why your life stinks now, Job. And they approach him with logic, and it feels unsatisfying. Why? Because Job is coming up against nameless things. He is facing a faceless oppression, and he doesn't know how to deal with it. What is relief for him in that book? It doesn't come in the form of an answer. It comes in the form of a poem and a shift, a recontextualization. God appears to Job and he says, Job, I'm going to take you from the heights and depths of all of the world, and I'm going to situate you in the place that you're in. And an answer is never given. God technically never really shows himself. But at the end of this, Job says, now my eyes see you. His life and his suffering is recontextualized in this, not just beauty or not just beauty in the sense of pretty, but beauty in the sense of horror, beauty in the sense of something that overwhelms him. But that's not just for the religious. This poem by Michael Longley that we're going to look at does the exact same thing. And Michael Longley, the poet, calls this an agnostic prayer, which I love. Here's this quote from Krista Tippett. You all probably listen to her podcast On Being. If you don't, it's phenomenal, especially her interviews with poets. She has one with Mary Oliver that's just exquisite. So here's what she says of Michael Longley's poetry. You carved out for your poetic voice in the midst of atrocity. Michael Longley's atrocity is growing up in the Troubles in Northern Ireland. A quiet insistence on celebrating normalcy, noting normalcy in the persistence of human activity. So I'm going to quote for you perhaps the weirdest poem. I can't remember if I said this, but Michael Longley says, the opposite of war, or at least he's referencing someone else. Maybe it might not be him. The opposite of war isn't peace; it's civilization. And you can kind of feel a lot of that in this poem that I'm about to quote. But this poem is called "The Ice Cream Man," and it's about this ice cream man on the Lisburn Road where Michael Longley grew up and where he raised his family, who was killed in a bombing. And Longley resituates us in the beauty and the normalcy of Northern Ireland as a gentle form of dissent and protest against the trouble happening around him. So this is him a cute old man. And this is the ice cream man. Rum and raisin, vanilla, butterscotch, walnut, peach. You would rhyme off the flavors. That was before they murdered the ice cream man on the Lisburn Road. And you bought carnations to lay outside his shop. I named for you all the wild flowers of the Burren I had seen in one day. Thyme, valerian, loosestrife, meadowsweet, twayblade, crowfoot, ling, angelica, herb robert, marjoram, cow parsley, sundew, vetch, mountain avens, wood sage, ragged robin, stitchwort, yarrow, lady's bedstraw, bindweed, bog, pimpernel. This list of everything you might see walking Northern Ireland, 21 flowers for the 21 flavors in John's ice cream shop. So normal, a beauty that was apparent to Protestants and Catholics alike, and he uses it as this way to push against the lack of civilization and cultivation around him. It's this quote from Toni Morrison. And actually, if you listen to Dave Chappelle's speech in receiving the Mark Twain Prize, there's this moment where Lorne Michaels, the executive producer of SNL, tells the story of Dave Chappelle quoting this overlap between poets and comedians, quoting this to the SNL team before they put on a really difficult show. This is precisely the time when artists go to work. There is no time for despair, no place for self-pity, no need for silence, no room for fear. We speak, we write, we do language. That is how civilizations heal. I love that quote on the tail end of that Longley poem, in part because that poem is so much a revel in words. And you can almost imagine him learning the names of these flowers as a kind of protest and as a way of passing on to his daughter, who he addresses in that poem, some beauty outside the horror that she feels. But let's move on to our final point here, which is that poetry can be, for us, maybe most importantly, poetry can be ambiguous. We often don't confront ambiguity. And when we do, if we scroll down in the Twitter thread, we often find someone lambasting any sort of ambiguity that we might try to hold. And instead, poetry asks us to leave the ambiguity in. Here's this quote again from Rowan Williams in The Edge of Words. We can deploy language as a means of exploration, invoking associations which may be random in one way, yet generate a steady level of unsettling, alternative, or supplementary meanings in the margin of the simple lexical sense. Before I show this image, which I think might be one of my favorites, I want to toss out this other phrase that Williams has, which is that whenever we put language in tension, whenever we are able to do what poetry does really well, which is to take two statements that are conflicting and we allow them to sit, we create a new kind of generative moment where paradox is amplified as the height of metaphor, as the height of simile, as Margaret Masterman says, and we're finally able to enter into a kind of poetical thinking where silence and memory and dissent and hope blend together without canceling each other out. And it's that kind of poetical thinking I think that we need more than ever. I think poetry does two things by helping us to sit with tension. First, it opens us up to potential in language, and second, it gives us a way of relearning. And Williams uses that phrase of the relearning our way. But by holding these statements in contention, we kind of open up a new negative space that we can sit with, one in which black and white aren't king, but we're actually able to experience a new kind of gray area. This is what poetry does for us. Poetry uninstalls all of our light switches and it reinstalls a dimmer switch so that we're finally able to dial in and adjust on the fly what we need and where life is taking us. It reminds me most of this poem that's really important to me, especially as I approach 30 next month and feel like I have fewer things than ever figured out. This line from T.S. Eliot, after his conversion, he writes this poem, Ash Wednesday, where he says, "Teach us to care and not to care. Teach us to sit still." He praised that line, confronting, if you can imagine, converting to a religion, being an American in London, converting to a new religion, dealing with the difficult situation around his wife's mental health. The thing he prays is so ambiguous. Teach me to care and not to care. Teach me to sit still. In other words, please give me a dimmer switch so I don't always have to be landing on some answer that's going to break the next time I turn around. And as soon as we can install this poetical thinking, we end up finding more than less. We may have fewer right answers, but we have a way of finding and asking that gives us more life. And that's, I think, what poetry can be for us today. So I'd love to just finish out with, by the way, I'll drop this in the chat. If you come back next week, I'll share this path with you. But for now, I'm going to share a link to some of the poems that I recited for you today. Actually, you know what? I've got one more, if you all don't mind, on this point of ambiguity. This is one of my favorite, and we're gonna look at this one next week as well. Yeah, the UK does have enough poets. You're right, but we've got all the good comedians, Samantha. This is a poet, again, from Christian Wyman, called Every Riven Thing. And it's such a clever poem. If you know the form of a pantoum, you'll see some of that here. But in this poem, Wyman takes one sentence: God goes belonging to every riven thing he's made. And he rivens it. He cuts it up. He breaks it up at the beginning of each stanza in order for us to find some new meaning. So here is Christian Wyman's Every Riven Thing. God goes belonging to every riven thing he's made, sing his being simply by being the thing it is. Stone and tree and sky, man who sees and sings and wonders why God goes. Belonging to every riven thing he's made means a storm of peace. Think of all the atoms inside the stone. Think of the man who sits alone trying to will himself into a stillness where God goes belonging. To every riven thing he's made is given one shade, shaped exactly to the thing itself. Under the tree, a darker tree. Under the man, the only man to see, God goes belonging to every riven thing. He's made the things that bring him near, made the mind that makes him go. A part of what man knows, apart from what man knows, God goes belonging to every riven thing he's made. Okay. I'm so thankful to be able to share all of that with you. Renee, do we have any more time for questions? Do we have a hard stop?
We have a hard stop, but let's give our friend Christian Shockley a big round of applause. A lot of love from the Media Education Lab community. We are thinking. And if you come on this 3-part journey with us, we guarantee you that you will deepen your understanding of what we think the connection is between poetry and media literacy. But that means you have to come back next week.
Yes,
Next
please.
week, Kristen's going to share some of the pedagogy of opening up people's thinking about the power of poetry. And wait till you see what he has in store for you next week. We're going to have a lot of fun. So thank you for joining me. Christian, thank you for taking us on a magical ride. We'll see you guys next week. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much. Bye.